Hello and welcome back to Quiet History. Tonight we begin with a child who was by all reasonable expectation never supposed to arrive. For 23 years, the King and Queen of France had failed to produce an heir. The court whispered. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about it. And then against the odds, a boy was born. And a relieved nation decided he must be a gift from heaven itself. They even named him after the idea. His real life would be longer, stranger, and far more demanding than any miracle story, but it started with a country exhaling in relief. If you find these slow walks through history restful, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. There is no pressure tonight, and if you feel like it, leave your town and your local time down in the comments. It is a small thing, but it helps other people who cannot sleep find their way to this quiet corner. And there is something pleasant about knowing that strangers in different cities are settling in for the same story you are. So get comfortable, let the room go soft and dim, and let yourself drift slowly into the long life of Louis XIV, the man they would one day call the Sun King. He was born on the 5th of September in 1638 at the royal chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just west of Paris. The country he was born into was tense, ambitious, and exhausted all at once. France in those years was a kingdom of perhaps 18 or 20 million people, far more populous than England or Spain. But it was not yet the Polish power it would later become. It was a patchwork of provinces, each with its own customs, its own courts, and its own stubborn local pride. Roads were poor, taxes were uneven, and real authority often belonged less to the king in Paris than to the great noble families who held land, soldiers, and grudges in the countryside. On the throne sat his father, Louis XIII, a serious and often gloomy man who had spent most of his reign struggling to assert himself. The true engine of the government was not the king, but his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu was thin, sharp, and tireless, a churchman who thought like a general. His single great obsession was the power of the French crown. He spent his years pulling authority away from the nobles, crushing rebellions, and dragging France into the long European struggle we now call the 30 Years' War, fighting mainly against the Habsburg rulers of Spain and Austria. It was a brutal, grinding conflict, and it ate money and men without mercy into this world. The Queen of Austria finally gave birth. She herself was a Spanish princess by birth, daughter of the King of Spain, which made her marriage to a French king a delicate thing in a time when France and Spain were enemies. For more than 2 decades, her childlessness had been treated almost as a national crisis. An heir meant stability. The lack of one meant that if the king died, the crown might pass to his brother Gaston, a charming and thoroughly unreliable man with a long habit of joining plots against his own family. So when the queen at last carried a child to term, the kingdom watched the way you watch a candle in a draft. The baby was healthy and the celebrations were enormous. Bells rang across France. Bonfires were lit in the streets. The boy was christened Louis and given the second name, Dudon, which simply means God-given. There is a small detail the courtiers love to repeat. The infant was said to have been born already showing 2 small teeth, which his nurses did not entirely appreciate since it meant that feeding the future master of France was an early test of patience. Whether the story is exactly true or politely exaggerated, it suited the mood. People wanted to believe this child was special before he had done a single thing. He was not an only child for long, a second son. Philip followed 2 years later, which quietly solved the succession problem and gave the future king a brother who would shadow him for the rest of his life. But it was the first boy who mattered most because everything in that age flowed from the eldest son of the king. The France that surrounded this royal cradle was a place of sharp contrasts. At the top sat a tiny circle of dukes, princes, and great officers of the crown, men who could raise private armies and who still half believed that a king was only the first among equals. Below them spread a wider layer of lesser nobles, judges, and royal officials, many of whom had bought their offices and treated them as private property to be passed to their sons. And beneath all of them, carrying the entire weight, were the peasants, the great mass of French people who farmed the land, paid most of the taxes, and were rarely consulted about anything. The cities held merchants, craftsmen, and a restless population that could turn dangerous when bread grew scarce. Holding this whole arrangement together was the Catholic Church, immensely rich, deeply woven into daily life and a power in its own right. Richelieu's France was learning to be centralized, but it was not there yet. The cardinal had built a network of royal agents called intendants whom he sent into the provinces to enforce the king's will and collect his money. The nobles hated them, and the resentment that built up under Richelieu would not simply disappear. It would wait, and it would surface in the childhood of the boy now sleeping at Saint-Germain. The infant prince would remember none of this. Of course, his earliest years were spent among nurses, governesses, and the strict ceremony that already governed even a royal baby's day. His mother adored him, and she was a warm and devout woman who would prove far tougher than anyone expected. His father, the king, was distant and unwell, more comfortable with hunting and music than with the difficult work of affection. Then, in the winter of 1642, the man who had truly run France for nearly 20 years finally wore out. Cardinal Richelieu died in December, leaving behind a kingdom that was stronger and more feared abroad, but also strained and full of buried anger at home. Before he died, he recommended a successor to carry on his work, an Italian-born churchman named Jules Mazarin, smooth where Richelieu had been severe and just as patient. The old king did not long outlive his minister. Louis XIII had been ill for years, and his strength drained away through the spring of 1643. He knew the danger of leaving a small child on the throne, and he tried to arrange the government carefully, hoping to limit how much power his wife and the new cardinal would hold. It was a sensible plan. It would last only a matter of days. On the 14th of May in 1643, Louis XIII died, and in that instant the boy who had been born as a gift to a desperate nation became its king. He was 4 years and 8 months old. He could not yet read a treaty, command a soldier, or even fully understand what had happened. But the crown of France had passed to him, and an entire kingdom now bowed to a child who still needed help climbing into his own chair. A throne at age 4. A child cannot govern a kingdom, and everyone knew it. So in the first days after the old king's death, the real question was not who wore the crown, but who would hold power in the boy's name? Louis XIII had tried to answer that question himself. In his final weeks, he had drawn up arrangements meant to limit his widow, sharing authority among a council so that no single person, least of all the Queen, could rule unchecked. He did not trust Anne of Austria with the whole of France, and given the politics of the time, his caution was understandable. It lasted less than a week. Anne moved quickly and cleverly. She brought the little king before the Parliament of Paris, the kingdom's highest law court, and had the dead king's will effectively set aside. The judges, glad to feel important, granted her full powers as regent. It was a neat lesson in how quickly the wishes of a dead king could evaporate once he was no longer in the room. From that moment, Anne of Austria governed France, and her son sat on the throne as a small, watchful presence, whose signature meant whatever the adults around him decided it should. The court expected her to dismiss Cardinal Mazarin. He had been Richelieu's man, foreign-born, and many assumed the Queen would clear out the old guard and rule with her own friends. Instead, she did the opposite. She kept Mazarin as chief minister and leaned on him completely. The partnership between the Spanish-born Queen and the Italian-born Cardinal would run France for the next 18 years. It was so close that people muttered the two were secretly married, a rumor that has never been proven and never quite died. What is certain is that they trusted each other, and that together they decided how the young king would be raised and how the kingdom would be run. Mazarin became far more than a minister to the boy. He was made the king's godfather, and in practice his guardian and teacher in the craft of ruling. He was a very different man from Richelieu. Where the old cardinal had been cold and forbidding, Mazarin was charming, flexible, and endlessly subtle. He smiled, he flattered, he delayed, he negotiated. He also gathered an enormous personal fortune along the way, which did nothing to make him popular. But he understood power, and he set out to teach the young Louis how it actually worked, not from books alone, but by letting the boy watch him handle crises year after year. Those crises came thick and fast because the kingdom Anne and Mazarin inherited was still at war. The struggle against the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria had been grinding on for a generation. Yet almost as if to bless the new reign, French armies began to win. Only days after the little king came to the throne, a brilliant young general named the Duke of Ennin, later known as the Great Condé, smashed a famous Spanish army at the Battle of Rocroi in the spring of 1643. It was a stunning victory, and it announced that France was becoming the leading military power of Europe. The boy king was far too young to grasp it, but the soldiers who won that day would loom large in his later life, sometimes as heroes and sometimes as dangers. For 5 more years, the wider European war dragged toward its end. Finally, in 1648, the exhausted powers signed the Peace of Westphalia, a vast settlement that ended the 30 Years' War and reshaped the map of Central Europe. France emerged with new territory and enormous prestige. On paper, the regency was a triumph. The young king's ministers had inherited a war and were winning it. They had ended a generation of fighting on favorable terms. Abroad, France looked stronger than it had in living memory. At home, the picture was uglier. Wars are paid for with taxes and loans, and the Regency had spent without restraint. Mazarin continued Richelieu's methods of squeezing money out of the kingdom. He raised old taxes, invented new ones, and sold royal offices and titles to anyone who could pay, which filled the treasury for a moment but mortgaged the future. He also delayed paying the salaries owed to the very judges and officials who had granted Anne her powers in the first place. People up and down French society felt the pressure. Peasants groaned under the weight of it, as they always did. But this time, the discontent reached higher into the law courts and the great noble houses, into exactly the people who had the standing to resist. Meanwhile, the boy at the center of it all was growing up in conditions that were oddly mixed. He was the most important person in France, surrounded by ceremony from the moment he woke. And yet money was so tight and Mazarin so careful with it that the young king's own household was sometimes shabby. There are accounts of worn sheets and threadbare furnishings in the royal apartments of a king who was treated as a god in public and pinched at home. He was taught the outward forms of majesty long before he held any real power, and he learned to keep his thoughts to himself, watching the adults maneuver around him. His education was practical rather than scholarly. He was never going to be a great reader of philosophy, and his tutors did not push him hard in Latin or theology. What Mazarin cared about was that the boy learned how kingship actually functioned, how to read people, how to weigh advice, how to wait. The cardinal took the young Louis into council meetings and let him sit in on the daily grind of governing. It was a slow apprenticeship, and at the time it looked unremarkable. Later, it would prove to be one of the most thorough trainings in statecraft any European monarch ever received. His younger brother, Philippe, was raised quite differently, and the difference was deliberate. The court worried about the old danger of an ambitious younger brother turning into a rival, the way the late king's brother Gaston had done. So Philippe was encouraged toward softness, toward fashion, dancing, and the lighter pleasures of court life, and discouraged from any taste for soldiering or rule. It worked. Philippe would grow into a brave but largely harmless figure who never seriously threatened his brother's throne, which was precisely the outcome the planners had in mind. By the late 1640s, the Regency had reached a strange and dangerous balance. France was victorious abroad and resentful at home. The Queen was firm but unloved. Mazarin was effective and despised, and the young king, still a child, was absorbing it all. He was learning that the smiling cardinal could be undone by the people who owed him money, that the great nobles bristled at being managed, and that the law courts of Paris fancied themselves a check on the crown. It was a brittle situation, and it needed only a spark. That spark came over taxes and unpaid salaries, over the wounded pride of judges and the ambition of princes. In the summer of 1648, the same year France was celebrating peace in Europe, the kingdom slid towards civil war at home. The trouble would drive the royal family out of their own capital in the dead of night, and it would teach the boy king a lesson he never forgot. That long and humiliating crisis had a name. The French called it the Fronde, the night they fled Paris. The trouble began as so much trouble does over money. By the summer of 1648, the law courts of Paris had had enough. The Parliament, which was not an elected body like a modern parliament, but a powerful court of senior judges, refused to register the new taxes and financial tricks that Mazarin needed. They drew up a list of demands aimed at curbing the cardinal's methods. Anne of Austria, proud and stubborn, decided to answer defiance with force. In August, she ordered the arrest of several leading judges, including a popular old magistrate named Pierre Broussel. Paris erupted. Within hours, the streets filled with angry crowds, and chains and overturned carts went up across the narrow lanes. This was the famous Day of the Barricades. The very name of the whole uprising came from the streets, because Parisian boys had taken to using slings in French Fronde to hurl stones at the windows of Mazarin's friends. Soon, everyone who opposed the cardinal was proudly calling themselves a Fronde slinger. The mockery suited the mood. People were tired, hungry, and furious at being squeezed by a foreign-born minister who lived in luxury while withholding their pay. For the regent and the cardinal, the sight of a barricaded capital was alarming. They were governing a kingdom in the name of a 9-year-old boy, and now that boy's own city had turned against them. They released Broussel to calm the streets, but they did not forgive. Quietly, they made a plan. On the cold night between the 5th and 6th of January in 1649, the royal family slipped out of Paris in secret, fleeing to the half-empty shadow of Saint-Jean-l'Élysée outside the city. The escape was so hurried and so poorly supplied that the young king, the anointed ruler of France, is said to have slept on straw in an unheated room. He was 10 years old, and he had just been chased out of his own capital in the dark. That night left a mark on him that never faded. To be a king, and yet to flee like a fugitive, to be cold and frightened and dependent on the loyalty of soldiers he did not command, was a lesson written into him at an age when lessons sink deepest. He would spend the rest of his life making sure that no mob, no court, and no proud nobleman could ever do that to him again. The roots of nearly everything he later built, including his decision to govern alone and to draw the nobility into a gilded palace far from Paris, run straight back to that flight on the night of Epiphany. The first phase of the day, the rebellion of the judges, was patched up within a year. A compromise was reached. The royal family returned, and for a moment it seemed the storm had passed. It had not. The second phase was worse because this time the rebels were not lawyers but princes, and princes commanded armies. The trouble centered on the great, the same brilliant general whose victories had thrilled the early reign. Condé had helped the crown against the judges, and he expected to be rewarded and obeyed. Instead, he became impossible, demanding, arrogant, and convinced that France could not manage without him. Mazarin decided the danger was too great and had Condé arrested early in 1650 along with 2 other leading princes. It was a bold stroke, and for a time it worked. But the families and supporters of the imprisoned princes rose up, the provinces stirred, and the kingdom slid into open civil war. Eventually, the crown was forced to release Condé, who promptly turned his full fury against the government. What followed was several years of confused and bitter fighting. The Fronde of the princes, Mazarin, blamed for everything, was twice driven into exile, withdrawing across the border while still pulling the strings of the government through. Letters to the Queen. The great nobles changed sides with bewildering speed. The princes who led the Second Rebellion spent almost as much energy betraying one another as they spent fighting the crown, which made them far easier to defeat than they had any right to be. Alliances formed and dissolved within a single season. Even foreign Spain joined in, supporting Kai against the French crown, so that France's greatest living general ended up fighting his own king in the pay of his country's old enemy. For the young Louis, these years were a long education in fear and patience. One episode in particular stayed with him. In early 1651, with the situation tense, a crowd of suspicious Parisians demanded proof that the boy king had not been spirited out of the city again. To calm them, the doors of the royal bedchamber were opened, and the people were allowed to file past the bed where the young king lay. Louis pretended to be asleep, while strangers shuffled through his private room to inspect him like a specimen. He held the pretense perfectly, and the crowd left satisfied. But a king who must lie still and feign sleep while his subjects come to check on him does not forget the feeling. It was humiliation dressed up as reassurance. The fighting reached its peak around Paris in the summer of 1652. The royal commander now was Turenne, another great general who had chosen loyalty to the crown over rebellion. His forces cornered Condi's army against the eastern walls of the capital near the gate of Saint Antoine. Condi fought desperately, his back to a city that had locked him out. He would likely have been destroyed there except for a remarkable intervention. A cousin of the king, the spirited duchess known as the Grand Mademoiselle, took charge of the Bastille fortress and ordered its cannon turned on the royal troops to cover Khan's retreat into the city. With those guns roaring on his side, Condi escaped the trap. It was a vivid, almost theatrical moment, and it changed the cousin's life for the worse. She had hoped one day to marry the young king. By firing the king's own city's cannon at the king's own soldiers, she ended any such dream forever, and she spent years afterward learning how long a royal grudge can last. Saving a rebel cousin had cost her a crown. But the rebellion was burning itself out. Ordinary Parisians grew sick of the disorder, the violence, and the ruin of trade. Condi's heavy-handed control of the city turned the people against him. By the autumn of 1652, the mood had shifted decisively toward the crown. In October, the young king was able to return to Paris, this time welcomed rather than hunted. Conde fled to serve the Spanish openly, a traitor in the eyes of France. The following year, with order restored, the hated Mazarin came back from exile in triumph, more powerful than before. The front was over. France had paid a terrible price. Provinces were ravaged, harvests destroyed, and thousands killed in a conflict that settled almost nothing except one thing. It proved to the watching young king above all that the great nobles and the courts could not be trusted with a share of power, and that weakness at the center invited chaos. He had seen what happened when the crown looked breakable. He was now in his teens, sharper and colder than before, and he was quietly drawing his conclusions. When his turn came to rule, He intended to make sure the kingdom never again had cause to doubt who was master. The cardinal's lessons. With the Fronde behind him, Mazarin returned to the work he did best, which was the patient management of power. The kingdom was battered but obedient again, and the cardinal used the calm to finish two tasks at once. He continued the war against Spain, and he continued the education of the young king. These years, from the boy's mid-teens into his early 20s, were when Louis truly learned his trade, not in a classroom, but at the cardinal's elbow. Mazarin made a deliberate choice that shaped everything. He did not try to keep the young king ignorant in order to hold on to power, as a lesser man might have done. Instead, he drew Louis deeper into the actual business of government. He explained his reasoning, walked him through negotiations, showed him the dispatches from ambassadors, and let him see how decisions were really made with all their compromises and deceptions. The cardinal was teaching him to be the kind of king who would one day no longer need a cardinal. It was a strangely generous act from a man famous for guarding his own position, and it created the ruler France would come to know. In 1654, the young king was formally consecrated. He traveled to the cathedral city of Reims, where French kings had been crowned for centuries, and went through the ancient ceremony of the sacra. He was anointed with holy oil, handed the symbols of royal authority, and presented to his people as the rightful sacred king of France. The ritual mattered to him enormously. It tied his rule to God and to the long line of kings before him, and it confirmed in his own mind the idea that would guide his whole life, that a king answered to heaven alone and to no rebellious subject. The boy who had once fled Paris in the dark now stood in a cathedral as the anointed master of the realm. Outside the ceremonies, the war ground on. France and Spain had been fighting since long before Louis was born, and both were exhausted, but Spain was fading faster. Mazarin pulled off a clever diplomatic stroke by allying France with England, then ruled by Oliver Cromwell after the execution of its own king. It was an odd partnership, a Catholic monarchy joining hands with a Protestant republic that had just killed its king. But Mazarin cared about results, not appearances. In 1658, the combined French and English forces led by the loyal General Turenne won a decisive victory at the Battle of the Dunes near the port of Dunkirk. On the losing side, still fighting for Spain, was the exiled rebel, beaten once again by the country he had betrayed. That same year brought a sharp reminder of how fragile everything still was. While campaigning in the north, the young king fell dangerously ill with a high fever. For several days it seemed he might die, and the court was thrown into quiet panic because his death would have meant a disputed succession and very possibly another civil war. He recovered, but the scare underlined a hard truth. The entire structure of the state rested on the life of one young man, and that man had no heir. The matter of his marriage could no longer wait. It was in these same years that Louis learned the most personal lesson of his youth. He fell in love. The object of his affection was Marie Mancini, one of Cardinal Mazarin's many nieces, a clever, dark-eyed young woman with a quick mind and a love of poetry. Louis was genuinely deeply taken with her, and for a time he wanted to marry her and make her Queen of France. It was the one moment in his early life when his heart pulled hard against his duty, and here both his mother and the cardinal closed ranks against him. Anne of Austria was horrified at the idea of her son marrying a minister's niece instead of a princess. Mazarin remarkably agreed with her, even though it was his own niece being refused. He understood that a king of France could not throw away a foreign alliance for love, and that allowing his family to climb so high would only feed the old hatred against him. So the lovers were separated. Marie was sent away from court, and the parting was painful enough that people still spoke of it years later. Louis obeyed. He set aside the woman he loved because the kingdom required it. That decision tells us almost everything about the man he was becoming. He had learned in the coldest possible way that a king's desires came second to a king's duty, and that even love was a tool of state to be spent where it did the most good. He would have mistresses later, many of them, and he would feel real passion in his life. But he never again let his heart overrule the interests of the crown. Marie Mancini had taught him the price of the throne, and he paid it. The marriage the kingdom needed was, of course, a political one. Spain was ready at last to make peace, and the deal was sealed in the autumn of 1659 with the Peace of the Pyrenees, a treaty negotiated personally by Mazarin with his Spanish counterpart on a small island in the river that divides the two countries. France gained valuable border territories, strengthening its frontiers in the north and the south. And to bind the peace, it was agreed that Louis would marry his first cousin, the Spanish Princess Maria Theresa, daughter of the King of Spain. The marriage carried a clause that would echo for the rest of Louis's life. As part of the bargain, Maria Theresa renounced any claim to the Spanish throne for herself and her descendants. In return, Spain promised to pay an enormous dowry. The catch, and it was an enormous catch, was that Spain was broke and never managed to pay the dowry in full. French lawyers would later argue that because the money had not been paid, the renunciation did not truly hold. That single unpaid debt planted the seed of decades of future wars over who had a right to Spanish lands, and eventually to the Spanish crown itself. The wedding took place in June of 1660 in the small southern town of Sanjendou near the border, in a ceremony of tremendous splendor. Maria Theresa was gentle, pious, and devoted to her husband, but she was also painfully out of place. She had grown up in the stiff, gloomy formality of the Spanish court. She spoke little French, and she had few interests beyond her religion, her small dogs, and rich Spanish chocolate, to which she was famously attached. She loved Louis sincerely. He treated her with public respect and private indifference, and she spent much of her marriage quietly enduring the parade of mistresses who held the affection she wanted for herself. So by the summer of 1660, at the age of 21, Louis had a kingdom at peace, a strengthened frontier, and a queen who would soon give him an heir. He had been crowned, schooled, and disappointed in love, and he had absorbed every lesson with a watchful, retentive intelligence. The long apprenticeship was nearly complete. Only one thing still stood between him and full mastery of France, and it was the very man who had taught him everything. Cardinal Mazarin had governed the kingdom for 18 years, and he was now old, ill, and very tired. Louis watched him fail with the patience he had learned so well, waiting for the moment that would finally make him not just the King of France in name, but the ruler of France. In fact, no first minister, Cardinal Mazarin, died in the early hours of the 9th of March in 1661 at the Château of Vincennes near Paris. He was around 58, worn out by gout, by years of work, and by the strain of running a kingdom through war and rebellion. He left behind one of the largest private fortunes in Europe, gathered during his long grip on French finances, and he left behind a fully trained successor in the young king he had raised. For 18 years, a cardinal had governed France. In fact, the question on everyone's mind was simple: who would be the next one? The answer came the very next day, and it astonished the court. Louis, now 22, summoned his chief officials and announced that there would be no new chief minister. He would govern France himself. When the old chancellor asked in the routine way of such meetings to whom the ministers should now address themselves for instructions, the king told him plainly that they should address themselves to him. He ordered that nothing of importance, no financial order, no diplomatic letter, no significant appointment was to be settled or signed without his personal knowledge and command. The men in that room had spent their careers serving a king who was a figurehead, while a minister did the real work. Now they were being told the figurehead intended to do the work himself. Few of them believed it would last. The young king liked hunting, dancing, and his pretty companions, and it seemed unlikely that such a man would sit for hours over dull reports and accounts. But they had misread him completely. Louis meant exactly what he said, and he kept his word for the next 54 years. From that day until his death, France would have no prime minister and no all-powerful favorite. There would be hard-working ministers, brilliant and indispensable, but they would be servants who carried out the king's decisions, never masters who made them. Louis had watched 2 cardinals rule France over his head, and he had decided that he would never be ruled by anyone again. He took the work seriously to a degree that surprised everyone. He set aside several hours every single day for the business of government, meeting with his councils, reading dispatches, questioning his ministers, and deciding matters large and small. He called it the craft or the trade of being a king, and he treated it as a job with daily duties rather than a glory to be enjoyed. He even wrote down his thoughts on the art of ruling in memoirs intended to instruct his son, full of practical advice about how to handle ministers, command respect, and keep power in one's own hands. He was not a deep thinker or a great reader, but he had patience, memory, and an iron sense of duty. And for the running of a kingdom, those proved to be the qualities that mattered. It was around this time that the image of the Sun King took firm hold. Louis had danced in court ballet since boyhood, and on one famous occasion years earlier, he had performed the role of the rising sun dressed in gold, the center of a glittering spectacle. He adopted the sun as his personal emblem and made it the symbol of his reign. The meaning was clear enough: just as the sun stands at the center of the heavens and gives light and life to everything around it, so the king stood at the center of France, the source of all order and authority, with everyone else revolving around him. It was a bold claim, and Louis intended to make it true. But announcing personal rule was one thing, proving it was another, and Louis understood that he needed to show quickly and unmistakably that the king was now the master. The man he chose to make an example of was the richest and most powerful official in France, the superintendent of finances, Nicolas Fouquet. Fouquet was clever, charming, ambitious, and enormously wealthy. As the man in charge of royal money, he had grown rich beyond reason, partly through the murky financial dealings that were normal in that age, and partly through outright self-enrichment. He had built up a vast network of friends and dependents, fortified an island stronghold off the coast, and cultivated the manner of a man who expected to be the next Mazarin. He had even built himself a country house so magnificent that it became the talk of Europe. The Chateau evolved, designed by the finest architect, painter, and garden designer in France. To celebrate his new palace, Fouquet threw an enormous party in the summer of 1661 and invited the king. It was a dazzling evening of fountains, fireworks, a banquet on gold plate, and a new play performed in the gardens. It was, by every account, the most spectacular private entertainment anyone had ever seen. It was also a catastrophic mistake. Fouquet had built the most beautiful private house in France and then invited the king to come and admire it, which was in hindsight the worst idea he ever had. The young king looked at the splendor that a mere finance minister had been able to afford, and he drew the obvious conclusion. This man had been spending the kingdom's wealth as if it were his own, and he was beginning to rival the crown itself. Louis bided his time. To strike too soon at so powerful a man was risky, so the king waited until he could act cleanly. A few weeks later, in early September, he traveled to the city of Nantes, drawing Fouquet along with him and lulling him into a sense of safety. There, on the king's own birthday, Fouquet was arrested by the captain of the king's musketeers, a soldier named Arton, whose name would later be borrowed for famous adventure stories. The fall was total. The most powerful minister in France was suddenly a prisoner. What followed was a long and dramatic trial that dragged on for 3 years. Fouquet defended himself with great skill, and much of the public, along with many writers and nobles, came to sympathize with him. Sensing that the king wanted not justice but a victim, the judges in the end voted not for death but for banishment from France. Louis was not satisfied. In a highly unusual move, the king overruled his own court and made the sentence harsher, changing banishment to life imprisonment. Fouquet was locked away in the remote mountain fortress of Pignerol, cut off from the world, and there he remained until his death many years later, never freed and never pardoned. The lesson was unmistakable, and it was meant to be. The king had taken the most powerful subject in France, a man richer than princes, and crushed him utterly. No one who watched it could doubt any longer that the days of overmighty ministers were over. After this, every official in the kingdom understood that their wealth and position existed only at the king's pleasure and could be taken away at his word. Into the space left by Fouquet stepped the men who would actually run the machinery of Louis' government. Chief among them, a hard, tireless administrator who had quietly helped bring Fouquet down. His name was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and over the next 2 decades, he would rebuild French finances, industry, and trade with the same relentless energy his king brought to ruling. The age of the great cardinals was finished. The age of the working ministers, all of them servants of one watchful king, had begun. The man who counted everything, the man who now took charge of France's money, had none of the dash of a Fouquet or the polish of a Mazarin. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was the son of a cloth merchant from the eastern city of Reims, and he carried the habits of the counting house with him all his life. He was heavy, humorless, and dressed in dark, plain clothes. He worked longer hours than anyone, suspected everyone of waste or theft, and his idea of a pleasant evening was a thorough review of the accounts. The courtiers found him cold and rather grim, and they nicknamed him the North after the chilly direction. But Louis valued exactly these qualities. He did not need a friend at the head of his finances. He needed a machine, and in Kohler he had found one. Colbert's view of the world was simple and forceful. He believed that the total wealth of the world measured in gold and silver was more or less fixed, so that one nation could only grow richer by taking trade and treasure away from its rivals. From this came his whole program, the system later called mercantilism or simply Colbertism. France must sell as much as possible to other countries and buy as little as possible from them, keeping the precious metals flowing in rather than out. To do that, France had to make at home the fine goods it had once imported, build the ships to carry its trade, and protect its industries with tariffs against foreign competition. For more than 20 years, Kula pursued this vision with the patience of an accountant and the energy of a fanatic. He began by going after the financiers who had grown fat under the old system. He set up a special court to investigate corruption, forced the worst profiteers to repay what they had stolen, and cancel fraudulent debts the crown had been tricked into owing. He brought a measure of order to the chaos of royal finance, increased the king's real income, and reduced the share lost to middlemen and cheats. He could not fix the deepest flaw, which was that the tax system was fundamentally unfair. The heaviest direct tax, the taille, fell mainly on the peasants, while the nobility and the clergy, the two wealthiest groups in France, were largely exempt. That injustice was too deeply rooted in custom and privilege for even Colbert to overturn, and it would haunt France long after his death. But within the limits of what was possible, he made the system work better than it had in generations. Then he turned to building. Colbert wanted France to manufacture luxury and quality goods that the whole of Europe would want to buy. He founded and subsidized royal workshops, set strict standards for their products, and lured skilled craftsmen from abroad to teach French workers their secrets. The royal furniture and tapestry works at the Gobelins in Paris produced pieces of dazzling quality. New textile and lace industries sprang up to compete with the Flemish and the Italians. Most cleverly of all, he established a glass works designed to break the Venetian monopoly on fine mirrors, which were among the most expensive objects in the world. That same French glass would soon line the walls of the most famous room Louis ever built. He looked beyond the workshops to the whole framework of trade. He improved roads and bridges so goods could move more easily. and he backed one of the great engineering projects of the age, a canal across the south of France linking the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. It took 15 years to dig, climbed over hills with a remarkable series of locks, and spared ships the long and dangerous voyage around Spain. It was a triumph of patience and engineering, and it still carries boats today, more than 3 centuries later. Cola also understood that trade needed protection and protection needed a navy. When he started, the French fleet was a sad collection of rotting hulls. Within 2 decades, he had built one of the strongest navies in Europe, almost from nothing. He created great naval bases and dockyards on the coasts, organized the supply of timber and rope and cannon, drew up rules for naval discipline, and trained a body of officers and crews. The same drive pushed France outward across the oceans. Cola founded trading companies to compete with the Dutch and the English in the East Indies and the West Indies, and he poured support into the struggling French colonies, especially the settlements along the Great River in Canada, encouraging settlers to cross the Atlantic and build a new France in the north. Nor did he neglect the life of the mind, because Colbert grasped that the glory of a great reign was measured in learning and art, as well as in money and ships. He helped establish royalties to organize and reward the work of scholars, scientists, and artists. He brought leading mathematicians and astronomers to Paris and had a grand observatory built for them. He set up systems of pensions to support writers and painters on the understanding that they would in turn celebrate the greatness of the king. Culture, like everything else in his world, was an investment, and the dividend was the lasting fame of Louis and of France. Taken together, Colbert's work transformed the kingdom. France in the 1660s and 1670s became the most populous, the richest, and the most admired country in Europe. Its goods set the fashion. Its language became the language of courts and diplomats everywhere. Its art and learning were imitated from London to Vienna. Much of that brilliance rested on the unglamorous labor of one tireless man who counted barrels of tar and bolts of cloth as carefully as a poet counts syllables. And yet there was a deep contradiction at the heart of it all, one that Cola felt more sharply every year. He was filling the treasury so that the king could empty it. Louis loved 2 things that swallowed money without limit. He loved war and he loved building. Every campaign abroad and every new palace at home drained away the wealth Colbert worked so hard to accumulate. The careful minister wanted peace, economy, and trade. The king he served wanted glory, conquest, and magnificence. Cola pleaded for restraint in long memoranda, and Louis read them, thanked him, and went to war anyway. The rivalry sharpened as a new figure rose at court. The Minister of War, a hard and aggressive man named Louvois, who came from a powerful family of royal servants. Louvois built up and reformed the army with the same drive Colbert had given the navy, and the 2 men competed bitterly for the king's favor and for the kingdom's resources. As Louis's reign moved deeper into war, it was Louvois and the army that increasingly won that contest, and Colbert who increasingly lost. The patient accountant watched his careful savings poured out onto the battlefields and into the gardens, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. When Colbert died in 1683, after more than 20 years of relentless service, he was an exhausted and rather embittered man. He had made France wealthy and was blamed for the taxes that wealth required. The common people associated him with the tax collector rather than the shipyard, and his funeral had to be held quietly at night for fear that an angry crowd might disturb it. It was a sour end for the man who had done more than anyone except the king himself to build the power of the age. But the foundation he laid did not vanish with him. The industries, the navy, the canals, the mines, and the colonies he created outlasted both Colbert and his master. He had given the Sun King the resources to shine, and now with money in the treasury and order in the kingdom, Louis was ready to build the stage on which his whole reign would be performed. He had a place in mind, a marshy spot in the countryside where his father had once kept a small hunting lodge, a palace built to tame. The place Louis chose lay about a dozen miles southwest of Paris at a village called Versailles. His father had built a modest brick hunting lodge there, set among marshes and woods, a quiet retreat with no special importance. To anyone looking for a site to build the grandest palace in Europe, it was a poor choice. The ground was low and damp. There was no great river nearby, and water for fountains and gardens would have to be brought from far away at enormous effort. Louis chose it anyway, partly out of attachment to the spot, and partly, many believed, because he wanted to build his seat of power away from Paris, the city that had once driven him out in the night. He summoned the same 3 men of genius who had built Fouquet's beautiful house, the architect, the painter, and the garden designer, and put them to work on a far larger canvas. The project would consume the rest of his life and a staggering portion of the kingdom's wealth. Over the decades, the little lodge disappeared inside an immense palace of stone, wing upon wing, hall upon hall, capable of housing thousands of people. Outside, the garden designer reshaped the very land, draining the marshes, leveling the ground, and laying out vast formal gardens of geometric paths, clipped hedges, statues, and fountains, stretching toward a great cross-shaped canal. The fountains were a problem that nearly defeated everyone. There was simply not enough water in that dry plain to feed them, and the engineers tried scheme after scheme to bring it in. They built an enormous and famous pumping machine on the river some distance away, a groaning contraption of giant wheels and pumps that lifted water uphill to supply the palace, and even then there was never quite enough. The fountains often could not all run at once, so attendants would switch them on just ahead of the king as he walked and shut them off behind him, creating the illusion of endless water for a master who must never be disappointed. The cost in lives was real, though it was rarely spoken of. Thousands of laborers and soldiers worked on the site for years, digging in the unhealthy marshland, and many of them sickened and died of the fevers that rose from the stagnant water. Their deaths were a quiet line in the ledger of magnificence. The court that would later stroll those gardens in silk and lace mostly never thought about the men who had drained them. The most celebrated room of all was a long gallery running along the garden front, lined on one side with tall windows and on the other with great mirrors facing them, so that the light and the gardens were reflected and multiplied down the whole length of the hall. This was the Hall of Mirrors, and the mirrors were French, made by the very glass works Cola had founded to break the Venetian monopoly. It was a deliberate boast in glass and gold. The most expensive luxury in Europe, mirrors, was here used by the hundreds simply because the King of France could. In 1682, Louis made the Great Change permanent. He moved the court and the government officially to Versailles, turning the palace into the working capital of France. From then on, to be near power meant to be at Versailles, and the entire ruling class of the country was drawn toward that single building like iron filings to a magnet. This was the deepest purpose behind all the marble and gardens. Versailles was not only a home and a showpiece. It was a trap, beautiful and golden, designed to tame the very nobles who had once humiliated him. Here Louis put into practice the lesson the Fronde had taught him. He required the great nobles of France to leave their country estates where they had always been dangerous and come to live at court under his eye. At Versailles, they could not raise private armies or stir up the provinces. Instead, they spent their days competing for his attention. Because at court, the king controlled everything that mattered to a noble. Every honor, every pension, every appointment, every mark of favor. A word of royal approval could make a man's fortune. A cold look could ruin him. 2. Keep them busy and dependent. Louis turned the daily life of the court into an endless, elaborate ceremony in which the smallest acts became precious privileges. His own rising in the morning and going to bed at night were formal rituals attended by crowds of nobles in which it was a coveted honor to hand the king his shirt or hold his candle. Who was allowed to sit in the king's presence, and on what kind of seat was a matter of fierce importance. A duchess might be permitted a stool when a lesser lady had to stand, and such tiny distinctions were fought over as if they were provinces. By making these trifles the center of his noble's existence, Louis turned warriors and plotters into anxious courtiers who measured their lives by how close they could get to him. A nobleman scheming over the right to pass the king his napkin was a nobleman who had no time to scheme against the throne. Around this glittering core spread the wider society of the age, and it is worth pausing to picture how people actually lived in Louis XIV's France from the top of the ladder to the bottom. At court and among the great nobles, fashion was an extravagant, expensive performance. Men wore long curled wigs, a style the king himself popularized as his own hair thinned, along with fitted coats, silk stockings, lace at the throat and wrists, and high heels with shoes whose red heels became a special mark of those in royal favor. Women wore tight bodices and wide skirts of rich brocade with their hair piled high in elaborate towers of curls. The food of this class was just as lavish. The age saw the birth of refined French cooking with long meals of many dishes, rich sauces, game, pastries, and sugar delicacies, all served with ceremony. New luxuries like coffee, chocolate, and exotic fruits grown in the king's own heated greenhouses appeared on noble tables. Below the nobility came the comfortable middle ranks of the towns, the merchants, lawyers, doctors, and royal officials who made up what was called the bourgeoisie. They were often wealthy, and they imitated noble fashions as far as their money and the law allowed, dressing well in fine but plainer cloth, and eating solid, abundant meals of meat, bread, and wine. Many of them dreamed of buying their way into the nobility through office or land, and a good number succeeded. Far below all of them, carrying the whole weight as always, lived the great mass of peasants who made up most of the population. Their clothing was rough wool and coarse linen, often the same garments for years, with simple wooden shoes for the muddy fields. Their food was bread and more bread, dark and heavy, along with thin soups, vegetables from the garden, and cheese. With meat, a rare treat reserved for feast days. They lived close to the edge of hunger, and a single bad harvest could push whole villages into starvation. They paid the taxes that built the palace they would never enter, and they knew their distant king mostly as a name and a demand for money. That said, Versailles was not entirely sealed away. The palace and gardens were surprisingly open to ordinary visitors who were respectably dressed, and a curious public could wander in to gawk at the splendor. There was even a brisk trade at the gates, where men who arrived without the required hat and sword could simply rent them on the spot in order to be admitted. A king who had built a fortress against the nobility had also almost absent-mindedly built the most popular tourist attraction in Europe, the Wars of Glory. For all the splendor of his palace, Louis believed that the truest glory of a king was won on the battlefield. He had grown up on stories of French victories. He admired the great generals of his youth, and he was convinced that war waged successfully was the best way to expand his kingdom and write his name into history. For most of his long reign, France was either at war or preparing for the next one. The peace and prosperity that Colbert built became in large part fuel for the fires of Louis's ambition. To make war on the scale he wanted, Louis needed an army unlike anything Europe had seen, and he built one. Working through his war ministers, the cautious Latelier and his fierce son Louvois, the king transformed the French army into the largest and best organized fighting force on the continent. In earlier times, armies had been ragged, temporary affairs, often little more than bands, following a noble commander. Louis created something closer to a permanent professional army with regular pay, standard equipment, uniforms, systematic training, and a chain of command that answered to the crown rather than to private lords. Supply depots were established so troops could be fed on campaign, and a measure of discipline was imposed that made the army a reliable instrument of royal policy. In peacetime, it numbered well over 100,000 men. And in time of war, it swelled to several 100,000, a force that dwarfed those of France's neighbors. The army needed a second kind of genius alongside the generals, and Louis found it in a soldier named Vauban, the greatest military engineer of the age. Vauban understood both how to build fortresses and how to capture them. Along the borders of France, he constructed a ring of powerful star-shaped fortifications, low and angular, designed to resist cannon fire and to sweep attackers with deadly crossfire. This iron belt of fortresses protected the kingdom and anchored every campaign. When Louis's armies besieged an enemy town, it was usually Vauban who directed the attack, advancing through carefully dug trenches with a patience and method that made the fall of a fortress almost a mathematical certainty. He took the chaos and waste out of siege warfare and turned it into a precise science. With this machine at his command, Louis went to war. His first venture came in 1667 when he revived the old unpaid Spanish dowry and a local inheritance custom to claim a portion of the Spanish Netherlands, the rich provinces of what is now Belgium, in the name of his wife. The campaign, grandly named the War of Devolution, was almost a parade. French armies under his veteran commanders swept through the Spanish-held towns. With little resistance, and another force seized the province of France to the east. It was over almost before it began, but the speed and ease of the French advance frightened the rest of Europe, and here Louis ran into the obstacle that would shadow the rest of his reign. The smaller powers did not want a France that could swallow its neighbors at will. The Dutch Republic, a small but immensely wealthy Protestant trading state to the north, took the lead in organizing resistance, joining with England and Sweden to pressure Louis into making peace. He gave way for the moment, keeping a string of valuable fortress towns but pulling back from the rest. He never forgave the Dutch for it, that a nation of merchants, a republic without a king, had dared to check the master of France, struck him as an insult that demanded an answer. He spent the next several years preparing his revenge with cold patience. Through careful and expensive diplomacy, he stripped the Dutch of their allies, even paying the King of England, Charles II, to switch sides through a secret agreement. Then in 1672 he struck. A massive French army poured into the Dutch Republic and very nearly destroyed it. Town after town fell in a matter of weeks, and the proud republic stood on the brink of total collapse. The disaster was so complete that the Dutch later remembered that year simply as the year of catastrophe. What saved the Dutch was their own land and their own desperation. In a drastic decision, they opened the dikes that held back the sea and deliberately flooded their countryside, turning the heart of their republic into a shallow inland lake that the French army could not cross. Behind that wall of water, the Dutch found new resolve and a new leader, a determined young prince named William of Orange, who took charge of the resistance. William would devote the rest of his life to opposing Louis, becoming the King of France's most persistent and dangerous enemy. The two men would struggle against each other directly and indirectly for decades. The flooding turned a quick conquest into a long, grinding war that pulled in much of Europe. Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and various German states joined the Dutch against France. Alarmed once more by Louis's appetite, the fighting spread across the Low Countries, the Rhineland, and the frontiers, and it claimed some of France's finest soldiers, including the Great Tin, killed by a cannonball while scouting on campaign. Yet France, with its huge army and Vauban's skill, more than held its own. When the exhausted powers finally made peace at the town of Namiens in the late 1670s, France came out ahead once again, keeping French Comte and a further line of fortress towns. By the end of the 1670s, Louis stood at the very summit of his power. France was the dominant nation in Europe, its army unmatched, its court the model for every other, its language and culture admired everywhere. The city of Paris formally honored him with the title the Great, and for a few years it genuinely seemed deserved. He was without serious rival the most powerful monarch in the Western world. Success made him bolder, and in his boldness he began to overreach. Instead of waiting for war, he started to take territory in time of peace. He set up special French courts whose job was to comb through old documents and discover legal claims to towns and districts along the borders. Then he simply marched in and annexed them. These peacetime grabs, the so-called reunions, brought France a string of new lands, the most spectacular being the great free city of Strasbourg on the Rhine, which French troops occupied in 1681 without firing a shot. He also bombarded foreign cities to bully their rulers, reducing parts of Genoa to rubble to punish its support for Spain. Each of these moves added to French power, and each of them deepened the fear and resentment of every other state in Europe. Louis had come to believe that his strength was so great that he could take what he wanted, and no one could stop him. He was, for the moment, very nearly right, but every seizure pushed his neighbors closer together, and behind the scenes, his old enemy, William of Orange, worked tirelessly to build the broad alliance that would one day be strong enough to face him. The wars of glory had carried Louis to heights no French king had reached before. They had also planted the causes of the long, bitter struggles still to come. The ones that would drain his treasury, exhaust his people, and turn the second half of his reign into something far heavier than the first. For now, though, he was the Sun King at his zenith, and his attention in these same years was turning in his private life toward matters of love, conscience, and faith that would prove every bit as consequential as his battles, love, poison, and piety. Behind the public face of the warrior king ran a private life that was for many years anything but pious. Louis had given up the woman he loved as a young man for the sake of duty, but he had not given up love itself. Throughout the first half of his reign, the king took a series of mistresses whose influence shaped the mood of the court as surely as any minister shaped its policy. The position of royal mistress became almost an office in itself with its own status, its own apartments, and its own quiet power. The first of the great favorites was Louis de la Vallière, a gentle, modest young woman who genuinely loved Louis and was deeply uncomfortable with the role she had fallen into. She bore the king several children, and for years she held his affection, but she was too shy and too tender for the cutthroat world of the court, and she suffered under the constant scheming and the guilt her position caused her. In time, the king's eye wandered, and Louise was gradually pushed aside. She eventually withdrew from the court altogether and entered a convent, where she lived as a strict and humble nun for the rest of her long life, doing penance for years she had come to regret. The woman who replaced her could not have been more different. Madame de Montespan was beautiful, witty, proud, and dazzling, and for more than a decade she reigned over the court as the king's acknowledged favorite, the unofficial queen of the festivities, while the real queen sat quietly in the background. She bore Louis a large brood of children whom he later openly recognized and raised to high rank, an act that scandalized the older nobility. Montespan's years marked the most glittering, pleasure-loving period of court life, full of balls, plays, and entertainments designed around her. Brilliance. Then came a scandal that shook the whole court to its foundations. In the late 1670s, a police investigation in Paris into cases of poisoning stumbled onto a hidden underworld of fortune tellers, alchemists, and self-styled sorcerers who sold their services to the rich and the desperate. They dealt in love potions, in poisons to remove inconvenient relatives or rivals, and in dark ceremonies promising to bend fate to a buyer's wishes. At the center of it stood a notorious woman known as Lavoisin, who ran a thriving trade in poison and black magic for the wealthy of the city. As the investigators dug deeper, the trail led horrifyingly upward into the highest ranks of the court itself. Aristocrats by the dozen were implicated, and the inquiry became known as the Affair of the Poisons. A special court was set up to try the cases, and over the following years many people were arrested and a number were executed, including Lavoisin herself, who was burned alive. The whole capital was gripped by tales of secret poisonings and midnight rituals. The most dangerous accusation of all touched Madame d'Antispan. Witnesses claimed that the king's own favorite had over the years bought love potions to keep his affection and had taken part in unspeakable secret ceremonies. And there were even whispers that she had sought poison to use against a rival who had caught the king's eye. Whether the charges were true has been debated ever since, and the evidence was tangled and extracted under fear. But it came close enough to the throne that Louis acted to protect both his former mistress and the dignity of his court. He intervened in the proceedings, shielded those nearest to him, and had a portion of the record sealed away or destroyed, so that the worst of what had been said would never be tested in open court. The affair quietly poisoned his feeling for Montespan, and it pushed the king toward a sharp turn in his private life. That turn took the shape of a woman utterly unlike the mistresses who had come before. Her name was Madame de Maintenon, and she had first entered the king's circle as the governess in charge of raising his children by Montespan. She was intelligent, calm, deeply religious and discreet, and she won the king not through beauty or seduction, but through her steady company and her conversation. As Louis grew older and more thoughtful, he came to value her good sense above the dazzle of his earlier favorites. Where the others had encouraged pleasure, she encouraged duty, piety, and respectability. The path was cleared for her by a death. In 1683, the long-suffering Queen Maria Theresa fell ill and died. She had borne her husband's endless infidelities with quiet patience for more than 20 years. And at the end, Louis is said to have remarked with unintended cruelty that her death was the only trouble she had ever given him. With the queen gone, the king did something extraordinary. He secretly married Madame d'Antinalor. The marriage was never publicly announced, and she was never made queen, but everyone at court understood what had happened. She became his constant companion and quiet confidant for the rest of his life. Under her influence, the whole atmosphere of Versailles changed. The wild parties faded. The tone became sober and devout, and the once pleasure-loving king grew increasingly preoccupied with religion and his own salvation. The court that had been famous for its glamour became famous instead for its solemnity, and a good many courtiers privately found the new piety rather a bore. This deepening religious devotion had consequences far beyond the king's own conscience, and the gravest of them fell upon a particular group of his subjects. France had a substantial Protestant minority, the Huguenots, who followed the teachings of the reformer Calvin. For nearly a century, they had been protected by a famous royal decree, the Edict of Nantes, which granted them limited freedom to practice their faith. They were a hard-working, prosperous community, strong among the merchants and skilled craftsmen of the kingdom, and their industry contributed greatly to the French economy. Louis, however, had come to believe that a great king should rule one people united in one faith, and that the existence of a separate Protestant church was an offense to God and a stain on his realm. Encouraged by the Catholic clergy and by his own growing zeal, he set out to convert the Huguenots gently at first, and then with mounting harshness. The cruelest tool was the practice of forcing rough soldiers to lodge in Protestant households where they bullied, robbed, and tormented the families until they agreed to convert. The conversions naturally were claimed as voluntary. Then, in the autumn of 1685, Louis took the final step. He formally revoked the Edict of Nantes, stripping the Huguenots of all legal protection and outlawing their religion entirely. Their churches were torn down, their schools closed, and their pastors driven out. Although the law forbade ordinary Protestants from leaving the country, vast numbers of them fled anyway, smuggling themselves across the borders to the welcoming Protestant states of the Dutch Republic, England, the German lands, and Switzerland, and some all the way to the New World. Estimates run to 200,000 or more, and they carried with them their skills, their wealth, and their lasting hatred of the king who had ruined them. It was, in the cold accounting of statecraft, a remarkable accomplishment. Louis had managed to drive out tens of thousands of his most skilled and productive subjects, hand their talents directly to his rivals and enemies, and weaken his own economy, all while being warmly congratulated across Catholic France as a hero of the faith. The revocation was wildly popular at home and celebrated as the crowning glory of his reign. In truth, it was one of the worst mistakes he ever made, and its damage would unfold slowly, deepening the divide between France and Protestant Europe, just as the continent was uniting against him once more. The Great War and the Great Winter, the years of easy triumph, were over. By the late 1680s, the rest of Europe had finally learned to combine against the overgrown power of France, and Louis spent the last 3 decades of his reign fighting 2 long, brutal, and ruinously expensive wars that slowly drained the wealth and strength his earlier years had built up. The first of these began in 1688. A great alliance of states led as always by his enemy William of Orange, and joined by the Holy Roman Emperor, Spain, the Dutch, and many German princes formed to resist further French expansion. Louis struck first into the German Rhineland, and there he committed an act that blackened his name across Europe. To deny the region to his enemies, his armies systematically burned and destroyed the towns and countryside of the Palatinate, leaving fine cities in ruins and thousands of people homeless. It was a cold, calculated devastation, and the smoking ruins of those German towns did more to turn European opinion against him than any battle could. That same year brought another disaster for French policy. William of Orange crossed the sea to England, drove out the Catholic king, whom Louis had supported, and made himself King of England in what the English called their Glorious Revolution. Now the wealth and the powerful navy of England were added to the alliance against France, and Louis's most determined foe wore a royal crown of his own. The war that followed dragged on for 9 grinding years across the Low Countries, the Rhine, Italy, and the sea. France won battles but could never win the war, and the cost was staggering. In the middle of it, a terrible famine struck the kingdom, killing hundreds of thousands of ordinary French people who had nothing to do with the king's quarrels. When peace finally came in 1697, Louis was forced for the first time to give back much of what he had seized, and to recognize William as the rightful king of England. The Sun King had been checked. He had barely caught his breath when a far greater struggle opened, this one over the richest inheritance in the world. The King of Spain, a sickly and childless man, was the last of his line, and his death would leave the vast Spanish Empire with its lands in Europe and its colonies across the Americas without an heir. The whole of Europe had spent years worrying over who would get it, because whoever did would tip the balance of the world. When the Spanish king died in 1700, his will left everything to Louis's own grandson, a young prince named Philip, on the condition that France and Spain never be joined under one ruler. Louis faced an enormous decision. To accept meant placing his grandson on the Spanish throne and binding 2 great realms to his family. To refuse meant handing the prize to his Habsburg rivals in Austria. He accepted, and his grandson became King of Spain. The other powers were horrified at the prospect of French influence stretching from Madrid to the New World, and Louis made matters worse with several provocative moves that convinced his enemies he could never be trusted. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, the longest and hardest war of his entire reign. This time, the alliance against France was led by 2 of the finest commanders of the age, the English Duke of Marlborough and the Imperial General Prince Eugene of Sèvres, and they handed France a series of crushing defeats unlike anything Louis had suffered before. At a place called Blenheim in Germany, they destroyed a French and Bavarian army outright, shattering the legend of French invincibility. More defeats followed in the Low Countries, each one driving the French back toward their own borders. By the late years of the war, the unthinkable seemed possible. The kingdom that had dominated Europe was fighting for its life, and enemy armies threatened to invade France itself. Then nature delivered a blow worse than any general. The winter of 1708 into 1709, remembered ever after as the Great Winter, was one of the coldest in the recorded history of Europe. The cold came suddenly and savagely. Rivers froze solid. The sea iced over along the coasts. Wine froze in the cellars, and fruit trees and vines died across the country. The crops failed completely, and a famine of terrible proportions swept the kingdom, killing perhaps hundreds of thousands more on top of all the dead from the war. People starved in the streets and froze in their homes. The army could barely be fed, and the treasury was empty. Louis, old and besieged, did what he could. He sent his own gold and silver table where to be melted down for coin, ate from plain dishes, and appealed directly to his exhausted people for support. He also sought peace, but the Allies, smelling victory, demanded terms so humiliating that they crossed a line even the desperate king would not cross. They insisted that he use his own French army to drive his grandson off the Spanish throne, turning his soldiers against his own family. Louis refused. He told his people that if he had to fight, he would rather fight his enemies than his own children. And the kingdom, against all expectation, rallied behind him for one last stand. And slowly the tide shifted. The alliance against France began to crack as alliances do once the immediate. Danger fades and the partners start eyeing one another. A change of government in England drained the will to keep fighting, and the death of the Austrian emperor suddenly made his brother the very man the Allies wanted to put on the Spanish throne. The ruler of the Habsburg lands as well, which raised exactly the same fears of one over mighty family that had started the war. The Allies no longer agreed on what they were fighting for. A late French victory steadied the line, and the weary powers came at last to the negotiating table. The peace, settled in a series of treaties around 1713, was a compromise that allowed Louis to save the heart of what he had fought for. His grandson kept the throne of Spain and its American empire on the firm condition that the crowns of France and Spain would always remain separate and could never be worn by the same man. France itself survived intact within its borders, but it gave up overseas territory to Britain, which emerged from the long wars as the rising power of the age. France had not been destroyed, but it had been exhausted, its treasury ruined, its people worn down, and its dominance broken for good. While these wars and disasters ground on, Louis suffered a more personal series of blows that struck even harder than the defeats. In the space of about a year, death swept through his family with appalling speed. His only legitimate son, the heir he had raised for the throne, died of smallpox. Then his grandson, a thoughtful and promising young man who had become the new heir, died of measles, along with his beloved wife, who had been the delight of the aging king's last happy years. Their eldest little son, next in line, died days later. 3 generations of heirs were wiped out almost at once, and the old king was left to bury those who were meant to succeed him. There is one small, strange detail in that wave of deaths. The single survivor among the children was the youngest, a frail boy of 2, and he most likely lived precisely because his governess refused to surrender him to the royal doctors, who insisted on bleeding their patients as a cure. That sickly toddler, kept safely away from the physicians who had failed to save the rest, was now all that stood between the throne of France and an uncertain future. He would one day rule as Louis XV. For the moment he was a small child in a nursery, and his great-grandfather was a grieving old man approaching the end of the longest reign in the history of France, the setting of the Sunday. The last years of Louis XIV were quiet, sober, and heavy with loss. The man who had once filled Versailles with music, dancing, and dazzling festivities now lived a strict and pious routine, ordered by his secret wife, Madame d'Antonal, and shadowed by the deaths of nearly everyone he had loved. The court that had been the brightest in Europe had become a solemn place. The old king moved through his fixed daily schedule with the same iron discipline he had always shown, attending to the business of government, even as his body began to fail him. He had reigned so long that almost no one alive could remember a France without him. He had come to the throne as a boy of 4, and he was now an old man in his late 70s. In the summer of 1715, his health gave way at last. A pain in his leg turned out to be gangrene, the slow rotting of the flesh. And in that age, there was nothing the doctors could do but watch it spread. Louis understood that he was dying, and he faced it with a composure that impressed everyone around him. He settled his affairs, said his farewells, and prepared for the end. Without panic or complaint, having decided long ago that a king must die as publicly and as gracefully as he had lived, he called for his successor, the little great-grandson who was now the heir, a child of 5 who would soon be king. Louis took the boy in and spoke to him with unusual frankness, offering the advice of a man looking back over a very long reign. He told the child not to copy his fondness for war which had cost France so dearly, and not to imitate his habit of spending too freely. He urged the boy to take care of his people, to try to live at peace with his neighbors, and to lighten the burdens his subjects had carried for so long. It was a remarkable confession from the proudest king in Europe, an old man admitting near the end that his greatest passions had also been his greatest mistakes. He also said something that captured how he understood his own role. He remarked that he was going, but that the state would always remain. In those few words lay the whole idea he had built his life around. The king was mortal and would pass, but the crown, the kingdom, the enduring power of France would continue beyond any single man. He had spent 72 years making the monarchy seem permanent and almost divine, and he wanted his last lesson to be that the institution mattered more than the person who held it. Louis XIV died on the 1st of September in 1715, a few days short of his 77th birthday. He had ruled for 72 years, the longest reign of any monarch in the history of France, and one of the longest in all of recorded history. An entire world had grown up and grown old under his rule. The reaction of his people told a complicated story. In his youth, he had been celebrated, even worshipped, the Sun King at the dazzling center of European life. By the end, decades of war, heavy taxes, famine, and hardship had worn away much of that adoration. When his funeral procession made its way through the countryside to the royal burial place outside Paris, the roads were lined not with mourning crowds, but by many accounts, with people who showed little grief and some who openly rejoiced, glad to see the end of a reign that had pressed so hard upon them. The man who had been hailed as the greatest king in Europe was laid to rest by a population exhausted by his greatness. Yet what he left behind was undeniable, and much of it lasted far longer than the resentment of that final summer. Louis had taken the scattered, rebellious France of his childhood and forged it into a centralized state with power gathered firmly in the hands of the crown. He had built a model of royal authority, often called absolutism, that kings across Europe studied and tried to copy. He had tamed the great nobility, turned them into courtiers, and ended the era of aristocratic rebellion that had terrified him as a boy. For better and for worse, he had made the king the unquestioned master of France. He had also presided over one of the greatest flowerings of culture in European history. Under his patronage, France produced brilliant playwrights, poets, composers, painters, and architects, and the period became known as a golden age of French art and letters. French became the language of educated people and of diplomacy across the continent. French fashion, French cooking, French gardens, and French manners set the standard that the rest of Europe imitated for generations. Versailles itself became the template for palaces from Spain to Russia, copied by rulers who wanted a little of the Sun King's glory for themselves. But the costs were just as real as the glories. He left France deeply in debt, its finances wrecked by his endless wars and his ceaseless building. The unfair tax system that spared the rich and crushed the poor remained untouched, a problem he never solved and largely never tried to. His expulsion of the Huguenots had drained the kingdom of skilled and loyal subjects and handed their talents to his rivals. The grand machinery of absolute monarchy that he perfected would, in the hands of weaker successors and an unreformed system, eventually grind toward a crisis. 3 generations after his death, the strains he had never addressed would help bring about the great revolution that swept his dynasty away. His immediate heir was the frail 5-year-old who would rule as Louis XV, too young to govern, so that France passed once again into the hands of a regent, much as it had when Louis himself was a child. In a sense, the wheel had turned full circle back to a boy king, and a kingdom run in his name. Louis XIV had lived an extraordinary life from a miracle birth that a desperate nation treated as a gift from heaven through a frightened childhood of rebellion, and flight to a long reign in which he made himself the very image of royal power and his palace the wonder of the world. He had been a careful, hard-working, often ruthless man who took the trade of kingship more seriously than almost anyone before him, and who paid for his ambitions with the wealth and the comfort of his people. The sun that he had chosen as his emblem had risen higher than any king's before it, and it had set at the end over a tired and changed country that would never be ruled in quite the same way again. And so we come to the end of our long, slow walk through the life of the Sun King. The fire has burned down low now, and there is nothing left to do but rest. If you are still awake, there is no need to stay any longer. Another quiet story is waiting for you on the screen whenever you would like to drift on with us. If you enjoyed this one, you are welcome to like and subscribe or to leave a thought down in the comments below before you go. But for now, let all of that wait until morning. Let your shoulders sink into the bed. Let your breathing slow. Close your eyes. And let the long reign of Louis XIV fade gently into the dark. Good night and sweet dreams.